Well, my name's Joe Collins, formerly Joseph T. Collins. That's the name I used to write under. I'm a herpetologist. I don't think I was born a herpetologist, but it sort of caught on fairly quickly in my life when I was young, probably when I was 12 or 13, and my brother Jerry and I caught our first snake, a queen snake, in southwestern Ohio, and brought it. We were at my Aunt Norma's house near a little rural area called Goshen, and we brought it back to her house and showed it to my dad. And in a moment of supreme weakness, he said, "Yeah, we can keep it as a pet." And he helped us build a cage, and we did all of that, and ultimately I accumulated so many animals in a very short space of time, something like 2.5 years. And they weren't just reptiles, they weren't just snakes, it was everything under the sun. I had created a small menagerie in the backyard of our house in Norwood, Ohio, and it abutted a park to the rear, and everybody who came to the park wanted to see my menagerie. And I guess this bothered the city fathers, who felt that they should be playing softball or using the swings, and so they came to visit my folks one day and told them that I was operating a zoo without a license. And so I had to shut my operations down, and I was sort of devastated by that. But my parents were easygoing. They said I could keep reptiles in the basement. And so I moved. I gave away all the other animals and moved the reptiles down to the basement. I had reptiles, crocs, and turtles, and a few amphibians. I got my first job as a nature counselor in 1956 when I was 16 years of age on Kentucky Lake in southwestern Kentucky, which was a great opportunity for me. I had a bunch of young men, substantially younger than I was, but nonetheless old enough to be active and want to go on snake hunts and things like that. And so we converted my 2 cabins into the snake hunting crew, and that's pretty much what we did all day long, was go out and look for snakes, which of course everybody liked to do. They of course wanted to have BB gun fights too, and I tried to control that, but sometimes they got away with BB gun fights. But those were back in the good old days, and when you could have BB gun fights, I guess. But most of the time we went looking for snakes. And during the course of that summer's work in 1956, we got to take 2 side trips, the whole camp did, down to Reelfoot Lake, Tennessee. Reelfoot Lake is located in extreme northwestern Tennessee, and the northern edge of it sticks up into Kentucky. And I got to see more reptiles, turtles, and amphibians in one place than I ever saw in my whole life. And it changed me. I was just fascinated by the animals and, of course, the great cypress Reelfoot Lake swamp. It was just heaven. In addition, while I was at the camp on Kentucky Lake, I made some discoveries of animals. I found animals that, according to all of the few field guides that were available back then, were not supposed to be found there. And that piqued my interest, and I started then I need to read up about these, so I started to acquire a library. And my interest then shifted from keeping live animals, almost completely shifted, to acquiring a library, preserving important specimens so that they would be available for study by others, and to going to herpetological meetings. By 1958, the Ohio Herpetological Society had been formed, and Roger Conant wrote his first book on the reptiles of Ohio. And this was a great impetus for all of us. We immediately were out looking for new things in places where they shouldn't be found. But in any event, I have a long history. I'm one of the 4 people living who has been a member of the Ohio Herp Society and SSER since their inception over 50 years ago. There are only still 4 of us who've been continuous members. The Ohio Herp Society in '67 was changed to the Society for the Study of Amphibians and Reptiles, the largest herpetological society in the world. And that was because Corson Hirschfeld and I got the votes together and made the change and created the new Journal of Herpetology and created the new publication Herpetological Review, which has the greatest distribution of any herpetological publication in the world today. In addition, Corson and I and Craig Adler did the first issue of the Journal of Herpetology and issued it in '68. Today, just a few years ago was, maybe last year, designated as one of the top 100 scientific journals published in the last century, and the only herpetological journal to receive that honor. So we're quite pleased with what the SSAR has become and what it has done, and the publications that were associated with it. At the same time, in 1968, there was a lot going on in my life. I took a position at the University of Kansas Museum of Natural History. Came into Kansas, into Lawrence in December of '67. Got moved into my apartment, rolled up to the hill on January the 1st to start my day of work, only to find out that they were closed on New Year's Day. Went home, came back on the 2nd, and finally got an office and got to work. Stayed there for 30 years, wrote 20 some odd books, the things that I did in the course of my career. Retired in 1997 and moved from that office to my home office. In the meantime, other things had happened. In 1974, while I was at the museum, I founded the Kansas Herpetological Society. It was brought about mostly because everybody knew my book was about to come out in August, and they sort of wanted something to rally around and get together and have meetings and go on field trips and talk to one another about their research. And students had kept urging me to do it, and so finally I did it. I wrote a constitution for them and everything like that, and we got it started. And I served as the editor of the newsletter for the first year, just to get that going. The Kansas Herpetological Society today, as of this recording, is the premier state scientific herpetological society, academic herpetological society in the nation. It is not a herpetocultural society. In fact, it does not allow herpetoculture. It is a society devoted to amphibians, reptiles, turtles, and their natural history in the state of Kansas, their conservation, research on them, things of that nature. And as such, it's held up as an example for all of the other folks who run these various state societies. Recently, I've been asked if I would come to Colorado and help them form an organization similar to Kansas's, and I probably will in the coming year, because I know how to do it. And it's not that I'm good, it's just that I'm old. I finally learned how to do these things. It took a while, but I do know how to do them, and I can help get them set up so that they don't run into the problem a lot of the other state societies run into, and that is the competition with herpetoculture. Not that there's anything wrong with herpetoculture, it's just that herpetoculture is not herpetology. And these people want a herpetological society, a society that is academic in nature and field-oriented. And herpetoculturists are more interested in keeping, raising, breeding, and sometimes selling, or at least trading or exchanging amphibians, reptiles, turtles, and crocodilians, which is a perfectly valid pursuit, but it's not an academic one. And so you have these two different groups of folks, and I've often encouraged them to form two societies and told them that I would belong to both. But I can't ever get the herpetoculturists to get together in one place and form their own society, but I keep waiting. We do have one national herp organization. I forget the name of it. It's a very active group in terms of legislation. And then we have one herpetocultural magazine, Reptiles magazine, which is produced, I believe, out of California, and which I encourage herpetoculturists to get because it's got some good articles in it for them. But herpetology, that is the academic aspect of what we do, is is what I'm involved in and have always been involved in. And we have a number of things that are going on in Kansas that are also successful. Besides the Kansas Herpetological Society, we have a Kansas Aneurin monitoring program in which people go out and listen to frogs and toads sing in the spring, maybe for 3 or 4 months, and score the strength of the choruses. And it's up online. People can access it and actually get some really interesting information about when these things do chorus, when their choruses peak, and see the differences between the different frogs and toads, what different times of year their choruses do peak across Kansas. The program's not as strong now as it was when I was running it on a grant, because then, of course, being on a grant, I was obligated to ride herd on the volunteers and make sure they got their information in. Once the grant went away, I said I would be more than happy to receive the information and maintain the website, keep it up to date constantly, which I do. But I could not spend my time calling folks because it was a very lengthy process. I had about 90 volunteers. That's a lot of people to call once a month to get them off their duff and out into the field. And I didn't do it. And of course, the number of volunteers then went down steadily, and there are only a few left now. But they're still going strong, and we're still getting data from them. It's an excellent example of why volunteerism doesn't really work, unless somebody's being paid to ride herd on the volunteers. I mean, it's one of those things where if you don't put money into it, you're not going to have volunteers. There's no such thing as just flat, straight volunteerism that works on a consistent basis. It'll peak and go down and peak depending on the person that's running it. But if you want to do something like monitor wildlife on a regular basis so that you have meaningful data over 30, 40, 50 years, it takes money. Another new program that we have is the Kansas Herpetofaunal Atlas, which was set up. It's a major website, which was set up by Travis Taggart and myself and Curtis Schmidt through the Sternberg Museum of Natural History at Fort Hays State University. It was initially funded by the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism, and it's been hugely successful at providing people with up-to-date information. Our new book, Amphibians, Reptiles, and Turtles in Kansas, by myself, Suzanne, and Travis, is based upon a large part upon the Atlas. And of course, within that book, we encourage you to go to the Atlas to keep up to date with discoveries that are made since the publication of our book. So a lot of this is all intertwined. We're very much aware that the world has gone electronic and will continue to advance further and further that way. And that electronic means of communication will become the predominant means of communication in the future. We're simply trying to bridge that gap and at the same time provide a more fundamental source, an actual book, a printed book, that because many people feel far more secure citing something like that than they do citing something which they think is more ephemeral, like the website, the internet. In addition to those things, during the Kansas Herpetological Society, of course, was one of the first organizations in the world to institute, well, it was the first herpetological organization in the world to institute herp counts, in which we actually encourage people to go out and find herps and get us a count, so we have a general idea of the comparative observable abundance of these animals in a particular spot. And that has been going for many years. I don't know how well it went this year, but it was a pretty bad year for herping with the heat the way it was, but I suspect that it will be around for a long time to come. Certainly the 3 field trips that the Kansas Herpetological Society holds each year are wonderfully attended, and all of that stuff is recorded. And again, it's one of those innovative things that the Kansas Herp Society did that no other society in the United States really participates in. Texas does a few of them, the Texas Herp Society, and they're a good herp society. But I don't think they do it with the gusto that we do, and their counts just don't seem to be as large as ours. So that's pretty much sums up what's going on with Kansas herpetology. We've been putting out a lot of other books. The Amphibians, Reptiles, and Turtles, the Cimarron National Grasslands in southwestern Kansas. The Amphibians, Reptiles, and Turtles of Cheyenne Bottoms, the new Pocket Guide to Kansas Snakes. There's another edition of that coming out, the 4th edition. It will be out in 2012. Early 2012. I've already submitted a text for it. And we remain quite active. I do, and so does my wife Suzanne, she's a premier wildlife photographer, and her photography graces all of my books, and she's often a co-author of those books because she's very, very good at editing what I write and telling me when I've overstepped the bounds of good taste, something that I need badly. And so that's where things stand at the moment. The future of the Kansas herpetofauna, the 100 kinds of amphibians, reptiles, and turtles we have, is linked to the future of all Kansas wildlife, which is in turn linked to the natural environment. There is so much going on that impacts wildlife of all sorts, including herpetofauna, my critters, as well as the natural environment, that it is going to take some kind of a concentrated effort on the part of governments at the federal, state, county, and city level, a coordinated effort to begin to set aside natural areas so that these creatures can continue to be amongst us. Now, there are people who don't care whether these creatures continue to be amongst us. And then there are others that feel very strongly in favor of having as many of these creatures amongst us as we can. The important point here is, are the people of this country, of the state of Kansas, of Douglas County, of Lawrence, where I live, educated enough to appreciate what can be seen and enjoyed in a natural environment? Or have we reached that point in our society where the pursuit of the almighty dollar will override every single thing that we think is important? I don't know. For example, I'll give you a really interesting conflictual example. There's a great deal of controversy surrounding the Sunflower Electric plant out near Holcomb, which Sunflower Electric wants to build. And it involves air quality, and I'm not an air quality specialist, so I cannot even speak to it. I don't know what it is that it will do to air quality. But Sunflower Electric had me come out with some of my colleagues for a summer to do a survey of their properties, 6 sections, for sensitive species. And we determined at the end of the fieldwork that their 6 sections were the best habitat available for threatened and endangered species in that entire part of the state. Because they didn't let anybody on it. They didn't do anything to it. True, the plant took up a small portion of one section. But man, they had burrowing owls all over the place. I mean, there were herps, there were long-nosed snakes, all the sensitive things in Kansas were just doing great. They were living in full, mature sand sage prairie that nobody had ever bothered. And all around those 6 sections owned by Sunflower were agrarian fields, completely denuded of any natural environment, which had absolutely no animals in them that were at least considered sensitive. What are you going to do? We have to put aside large tracts of land for wildlife, and we must make it financially rewarding to do so through easements in which we pay the owner, or through tax breaks. This state has a history of fighting that. They don't like the idea of any land having any controls put on it. particularly by environmental groups or the federal government. That's incredibly unfortunate and so very short-sighted of the people of Kansas, who, if they merely looked to the West, would understand that if Teddy Roosevelt hadn't created the Grand Canyon National Park, we'd have McDonald's growing down in the bottom of it. We have got to do that. And somehow or another, the attitude of the people of Kansas has got to change. We must embrace all kinds of big parks, big wildlife areas, whether they be federal, Nature Conservancy, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks and Tourism. I don't care who controls them or sets them up. We've got to have them, or we're never going to have good natural environment. And if you don't have good natural environment, you're not going to have the full complement of wildlife that lives in it. And if you don't have the full complement of wildlife that lives in it, some of it that will be missing will be some of my animals, the herpetofauna, the amphibians, reptiles, and turtles of Kansas. One can only hope that our educational system will pick up on this and that generations that come will begin to appreciate it and start electing people that know how to do this stuff. I won't be around to watch it happen. It belongs to the next generation.